All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully you can hear me. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about filling in the academic gaps. Again, I just want to thank you for joining us for the Think Thursday every month. Hoping to be able to give really good tidbits. I know it's very short, but just something to help when it comes to our practice teaching. Anything that we can offer, we're willing to do. So thank you again for joining, and we're just going to go ahead and get right into it so we won't be before you too long. Whoops. Okay. All right. So my name is Kristen Campbell. Myself, along with my husband, Justin, we started the Urban Connection Project to raise the odds of success for inner city students. And we do that through culturally responsive teaching. So we'll talk about what that means in just a little bit. But we do, like I said, we do that through culturally responsive teaching, and we use our own progress monitoring tool to do that. And then we also provide professional development as well as one-on-one or small group mentoring and coaching. And lastly, we also provide our resources. So we have several resources that, again, I'll get to a little bit later in today's presentation. And soon we'll be adding to that with that progress monitoring tool that will be released next month. So make sure you're on the lookout for that. And actually, we're approaching our 6-year anniversary. We started back in 2014, October of 2014. So very soon, we will be having our 6-year anniversary. We'll be running some sales, putting out new products. So we're gearing up for that. So make sure you keep in touch, look at our website, take a look at our emails, things like that, and stay abreast of what we're doing with this new year for us coming up. So as you know, if you've been with us before, if you haven't, letting you know now, we believe that it's really important in this session. Again, it's not going to be very long, but in this session for this little bit of time to really just get outside of your comfort zone, because that's where the magic happens. That's really where the growth happens, the learning happens. So if you're sitting back, doing other things, totally get it. I do it all the time with webinars, but at the same time, try to just lock in a little bit and really think a little bit deeper about some of the topics that are presented, and try to get outside of your comfort zone, jot some things down for yourself to try, and just really challenge yourself to use the information so that you can bring the magic, the growth. So make sure you are doing that. And like I talked about before, we do our work primarily in the realm of culturally responsive teaching. Again, if you've been with us before, you kind of know the spiel, but if not, just going to quickly go over what that means. So I'm a very visual person. That's why you'll see it here in this visual representation. But the cultural awareness is our first pillar, our first component of culturally responsive teaching, and that's here represented by the soil because it's something that we can't see. It's inside work you have to do for yourself in order to be able to build upon that. Again, it's the soil as well, because if it's not solid, it's really hard to build anything from that in order to be a successful teacher for your students or a successful educator. So it's, again, that inside job. It's really taking a look at your experiences, your perceptions, and how that affects the outcomes that you have with your students, and then being able to facilitate that same work within your students as well to really come to a better awareness of each other. So again, cultural awareness is one of the first components that we talk about when we are digging into culturally responsive teaching. The second component is systems. So you'll see there as the foundation, that first layer, again, has to be solid in order to build from there. Your systems are really talking about your expectations, your consequences, your rewards, your routines, your procedures, everything that should be running systematically that all parties should be aware of. We want to make sure that it's solid and that it tries to be as specific as possible and all-encompassing as possible in order to eliminate implicit and personal bias that is natural, in order to eliminate that from our day-to-day interactions with our colleagues, with our students, and really allow everyone to be in the know of what to expect from each other and to be held accountable. So the next layer you'll see there is relationships. Relationships being primarily teacher to student, but really between all stakeholders that are responsible for the success of the student, how we can really cultivate relationships to be as strong as possible so that we can use them to really help that student be successful. So how we can, really strengthen relationships. And the last pillar you'll see there is rigorous and accessible content. Rigorous, kind of self-explanatory, but accessible being two things. One, how are we making it accessible to our students in a way to scaffold, in a way to fill in the gaps? So that's what we're going to, talk about today, as well as how are we making it accessible to them so that they can relate to it, so that they can see how this information applies to their own real life. And so that's another aspect of rigorous and accessible content. So like I said, that was kind of the quick spiel of it. It's so much more than what I just mentioned. So make sure you go a little bit further, dig in a little bit more. If you want to know more about any one of these, we have resources for, or even contacting us directly. But today we're going to be talking about that accessible content piece and how we can fill in some of the gaps in order to make our content more accessible for our students. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, today's not going to be long, so I'm going to kind of just go through a lot of this. If there are questions, I'm going to leave my email in this presentation as well. Please feel free to email me for more information, or even if you want to try some of these things out and you'd like some additional help, whatever that looks like, do not hesitate to reach out. Additionally, there is a chat box. We're not really going to use that much for today's presentation. However, if you would like to send me a personal message right in the moment, or even to everyone, feel free to do that in your chat box as well. As we're going through this, I do have it up, so I'm looking in case there are any questions. So again, filling in the academic gaps. So there's going to be three components that I want to touch on today very quickly, very kind of broad overview of these three components. Number one being vertical alignment, why that's important, how it can be used, a standard cheat sheet, that's just what I call it, and reference pages. So those three components are ways that I personally have been able to kind of fill in the gaps and scaffold for my students, provide some differentiated instruction that doesn't necessarily require me to actually give live instruction every time, but give them the resources that they need to kind of differentiate for themselves. So these three components were super helpful in the classroom, and I can only imagine that I would find them even more helpful in this virtual journey that we're all on right now, whether you're in hybrid, some in class, some virtual, or fully virtual, whatever that looks like for you. I think these components can be very helpful for your students to help fill in some of those gaps due to the times. So let's dig right into the first one, vertical alignment. So most of us as educators kind of know what that means, but just to be clear, when I'm saying vertical alignment, I mean knowing how the standard that you're teaching progresses from year to year. So what that standard looks like all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade, but even more importantly, the couple of grades before and after what you specifically teach, so that you're aware of what they should know, or what prerequisite skills they should have down packed in order to be successful in your grade level, as well as where they're going. Because again, we don't necessarily want to keep them stagnant if they're ready to move on, and we need to know exactly how we want to teach those specific standards in order to set them up for success moving forward. So super important there. Once you have that information, and you've studied and really looked at some of the differences, even very subtle words from one grade to the next, to help you understand how the standard changes as it moves, or maybe I know in math it may be a new standard that isn't in the previous grade, but looking at what else is within that group of standards and how some of those others may affect the standard that you're working on. Once you have that knowledge, ways that we want to use that to help fill in the gaps. One of the major ways that I would use it is in my anticipatory set, how I'm hooking my students in, or the practicing I'm giving them at the beginning of the lesson before we really dig into the meat. One of the things that I have found, I guess, is that even though you know what they should have learned prior to coming to your classroom, a lot of times that's not always the case. And rather than assume or even, I guess, find out later, I find it most helpful to just plan in having some time to present some type, whether that's a game or whatever your anticipatory set looks like, having some time to make sure that they know that those prerequisite skills that maybe they should have learned, years prior, having time to really make sure they know it to the level that they need to before we move into today's work. So getting that out of the way at the very beginning of the lesson, working on some of those prerequisite skills, super helpful to kind of help even the playing field before moving on to what we would be working on that day in relation to this year's standard. Another reason or another way that we can use that knowledge of vertical alignment is in our standard cheat sheets, which I'm going to get to next. But you'll want to have that knowledge in mind if you choose to start creating standard cheat sheets. Again, I'm going to go over what that means. So just to give a little bit of context, if I was working with standard, I'm just going to use reading because that's kind of my go-to, but a reading standard for informational or literature, RI or RL2, which is about main idea and theme, key details, summarizing. If I were to know vertical alignment for that standard, what that looks like, I'd know that in first grade, we kind of start with like, what's the topic or central message, right? Maybe a couple key details, all the way to, let's just go to 8th grade, where they're asking for the central idea and how that relates to the supporting details, specifically or characters or events, etc., and an objective summary. So it builds over time. If I know that progression over time, I can then use that in my lesson to address what should have been covered. So if I'm all the way in maybe, let's say, 3rd grade at this point, I still might want to make sure they know how to identify a topic before we really get into main idea. Even though they should know how to do that, that might be what my anticipatory set would be about for that day, so I can ensure that it happened, that knowledge has been mastered before I'm expecting them to actually get to 3rd grade standard. So just to give a little bit of context there, I'm going to use that same example as I go through some of these other ideas. So vertical alignment has to be super solid if you want to help your students scaffold, fill in gaps in order for them to be successful. The next tip would be to create what I call a standard cheat sheet. This actually kind of started somewhat by accident when I was teaching, but I found that it was one of the most helpful tools that I could have ever accidentally started creating. So what I would do was create kind of these half sheets that I labeled with the standard that we were working on that day. And in that standard, I would give several different pieces of information that the student would need to be successful in mastering that standard. So I'm going to go over what types of information should be included in just one second. I would then give that standard cheat sheet to the students as I'm teaching. So when we get to that standard, I would then hand out the cheat sheet, and they kind of all knew it would go into a specific place within their notebooks. Again, digitally, that could just be a specific folder that you have on the Google Doc or whatever it is that you're using. But, so it's organized, because the power in it is for them to be able to access it on their own when they need it. So it starts out with, yes, everybody's using it. Everybody's going to follow along with me. Everybody's going to look at this as we're performing the skill for that standard. Eventually, though, some may not need it as much, some may need it a little bit more, but it helped to fill in those gaps and provide the scaffold that was necessary, or that differentiated instruction that might be necessary for students at varying levels. And again, I didn't have to be in a million places at once because everybody had access to it within their own notebook. All right, let's get into what's included. So for that standard cheat sheet, a couple of the things that I would include is a big picture of the standard. So again, going back to RI2, RL2, I might put at the top something like, main idea, key details, summarizing. Those are the big pictures, just so that they remember, okay, in this, whenever I'm doing those skills, this is that standard, and these are the things that I will need. So I kind of give like a big picture, quick phrases of what is this really all about, meat. What is it really all about? So big picture. Next would be a sequential order of steps to show mastery of this skill. So think about metacognition. What is it that goes on in your brain when you are performing the skill from top to bottom, from start to finish? Write it down as detailed as possible. And in that detail, even thinking about what tips you have and what misconceptions you know students typically trip up on, even yourself maybe trip up on, and how to ensure that they don't. So for example, again, thinking about that RI2, RL2, main idea, theme, key details, summarization. If I'm going to give sequential order, maybe it's identify the topic first. Again, tips and misconceptions, I might add in to identify the topic, look at what pictures are included, look at what words you see repeated, look at the title. I'm giving them tips. How am I going to do that? Don't just look at the first sentence of every paragraph, because that's kind of a misconception that students have. That might be something I include. So I'm giving them sequentially. Okay, that's what you're going to do first. Then you're going to look at each paragraph and identify details that give us more information about that topic. Okay, well, how would I do that? What kinds of information? My tips for that might be look for information that tells you who, what, when, where, how, and why. Look for information that gives, whatever I come up with, but however I would determine a key detail, I want to give some of those tips to them. So I'm not just telling them to go do it, but I'm actually giving them some of my own look fors and some of my own, hey, make sure you don't do that as well, those misconceptions. So sequentially, from start to finish, if I wanted to accomplish this task that this standard tells me I need to, how would I go about doing that? What are the tips that you have, and what are the misconceptions? These are all things that I think as teachers we often do. We say it's auditory. We might even ask them to write down some things. But when you have a system where every time a new standard is introduced, they get this cheat sheet, they know, okay, when the teacher is modeling how to perform this skill, this task, they're actually showing me as well on the cheat sheet, okay, so this is what I'm doing. Notice here, notice how I'm doing this. I'm using this tip. I'm making sure to avoid this misconception. Helping them see how you yourself are even utilizing that as you're modeling it allows them to, again, have that additional help, kind of that differentiated instruction when they need it. Okay, where do I fall in, or where maybe am I falling short? If I'm not quite able to reach the full standard, at what point do I fall off? At what point do I get stuck? Again, even for you, then as a teacher, that helps you to, okay, where do I need to fill in? What, maybe you need some extra tips over here. Where is it that this isn't as clear as it needs to be? So that's super helpful to have them, and again, store them, give them a home so that students can access them when they need them. Additionally, on this cheat sheet, I often would provide an example. So whether that's a sample problem for math or a sample paragraph for language arts, or whatever it is that you're teaching, give an example of what this looks like and lay that out as well. And lastly, I would give related assessment questions. That's something that I learned much later in the teaching career. A lot of times we do the skill, we've done it a million times, and then they get to the test, and because they asked it a certain way, the students are stuck. How do I do this? We never did this before, and you're sitting there like, yes, we did for weeks. So I would provide related assessment questions that help them to see how when I perform this skill, how might I be assessed or questioned to show that I know how to do this. So I would just list at the bottom a couple different ways that they may see this question being asked, so that they are exposed to that as well. So those are the components that I create for each standard. So again, I'm just going to go back to reading, but if I'm teaching reading, there's 10 technically. We don't really talk about the 10th one, so 9 that I would create for literature and for informational text. And this would live in what I called a reference section in the back of their notebooks. Again, this for me just really helped to kind of twofold. On my end, it helped me to see where students were in their understanding, so I can tell where they are falling off, where they're having issues, where something's not connecting. And then on their end, it provides that concrete, that tangible help that may be necessary when performing the task, because we don't want inaccessibility to be the reason that we can't measure mastery. So what I mean by that is, even though, and I was going to talk about this a little later, but even though we're providing this help, this addition that won't be there, for a test, many people will say, that's true, but I'd rather have a student use this and be able to truly access the skill and show me mastery and practice the skill with this help and eventually maybe not need it, than to repeatedly fail at trying over and over again and never even gain access to the skill. Personal philosophy there. So super helpful for me. The last, there we go, the last resource that I would use and provide for students in order to help fill in those gaps are reference pages. And well, that's what I call them. But so basically, this is to level the playing field of background knowledge to provide access to the skills. So reference pages are kind of like a bank of information related to the skill. Okay, so what I mean by that is, again, let me go back to my example, RI2, RL2. RL2 talks about theme. Just a really quick story. I remember teaching theme, and I didn't provide a reference page. This was prior to me understanding how I wanted to go about this. What I found was, I'd be like, I'd ask the students okay, so what do you think is the theme? And I had gone through, I feel like I'm a decent teacher. I had gone through what I felt like was, all the steps that are necessary. You should be able to come up with a theme. And I'd say probably 8 times out of 10, they just still wouldn't come up with the theme. And I'm like, kind of banging my head against the wall. What is it? Why is this not happening? And I actually had a colleague that, I guess, showed me and talked to me about the need for reference pages, because that bank of knowledge, that background knowledge of common themes or sayings, just wasn't even available to my students, and that wasn't something I had considered. And so, again, thinking about theme, providing like a bank of common themes, like common sayings that as an adult we've probably heard before. That's not something that maybe our students have heard. Maybe culturally that's not something they've heard from their own parents. Whatever the reason may be, if the background knowledge isn't there, it's really hard to access the skill. And so just being very aware to provide that, from the beginning. So again, in this like reference section that I would create, it would have the cheat sheet as well as any reference pages that were necessary for them to be successful. So the cheat sheet shows you how to identify the theme, all the things that you're going to go through, how to identify the key details and how they related to the theme. In order for you to do that, though, flip the page, look at a bank of common themes and see, is it about greed? Is it about trust? Is it about what's the theme that you think it might be about? Even though these are all things that in my head I could just come up with, in my students' head that might not be something that, again, they have in their background knowledge. So providing that allows them that access, again, because they're still choosing and being able to justify, their answer based on the evidence. Again, this can go for math, it can go for science. I think there are, again, things that we, as teachers, we often provide, but intentionally giving as many of these resources as possible from the beginning, and providing a place where they can go back to it and it's labeled with the standard and everything kind of has a place and a clear understanding. It really helps students to have that a little bit more of a level playing field and filling in the gaps where necessary with these resources so that they can access the skill. Again, for me, it's more important for them to access that skill with the help and eventually not need it than it is to provide too much help and they've never gotten access to it from the very beginning. So that's just, again, my philosophy. So pretty quick today, but just to look back over what we talked about. So really know your vertical alignment. You've got to know it in order to even be successful with these other pieces. Additionally, thinking about how you can incorporate that into your anticipatory sets at the very beginning of your lesson, ensuring that you are checking for mastery of those prerequisite skills prior to getting into your standard for that day. Additionally, create those standard cheat sheets. Like I said, it was a mistake on how it started. So I was doing them on the go, but by the next year, I really had them all set and ready to go for every standard. So that was something that I had worked on so that I could just print off, pass out to my students when we started that standard, be able to refer back to it, have a place in their notebooks where it lived so that they could refer to it when they needed. And again, if you are a little nervous about giving too many resources or being able to ensure that they can do it without these resources, then just be intentional about I wouldn't say taking away, but maybe asking students not to go there, just yet as the year goes on. In the very beginning, give it to them. Give them the access. Allow them to be able to feel success with that standard and get better and better and better with it to eventually not need it, just like any of us with any new thing that we learn. Eventually you don't need the instruction manual. You're not sitting there reading every time. I've made the same recipe a million times. I don't really need to go read the recipe. Same idea. Eventually, naturally, they won't, most of your students won't really need it. Those who do really need it probably could use, they needed that from the beginning anyway, and could continue using it because they're getting more and more practice at being successful with the skill, which is really what we're looking for. So I personally would not be too hung up on that. That's been a question when presenting this with previous teachers, so I just wanted to address that. But again, if you're worried about it, just be intentional, slowly encouraging the removal of those resources over the course of the year, and understanding that there are still going to be specific students who could probably still heavily use those resources even as the year goes on, and that's okay too. And lastly, the reference pages kind of falls in line with what I just said, but being able to provide that, having a place for it to live, and again, eventually they'll know those things, and if they don't, that's okay too, but more practice with the skill, being successful with that skill is what we're looking for. So if you'd like any examples, if you want to try to create your own and then would like me to see it, anything from today that you feel like, man, that sounds good, I'm not exactly sure where to start, or I would like some feedback, et cetera, please feel free to email me. My email is right there on the screen. Let me know how I can be of assistance. Again, this was something that really was a game changer for me. So I really, really encourage you to try it out with your students and let me know how it goes, or let me know where I can be of support in that implementation. Again, we do have products, so make sure you take a look at those. Head over to our website. We actually have a bundle deal going on right now where if you get the Confessions of an Inner City Teacher book along with the Culturally Responsive Teaching workbook, those two together are at a discounted price for the month of September. So get one for yourself or for a colleague. Additionally, we have the Social Studies Connection Curriculum Guide. That is for my middle grade social studies teachers. So if you're looking for something to really attack social studies from a little more holistic view, a little bit more current view, that would be the resource for you. So again, go check it out. And lastly, our next Think Thursday is the third Thursday of October. And we actually are going to let you guys choose the topic. So there will be a survey that will be sent via email. please click on that survey and vote for the topic that you think would be most impactful for October, what you want to hear from us in regards to, and let us know what we should start planning for. So again, thank you so much for joining me today. I know we got through relatively quickly, more on time with what we were planning for. I know we went into things a little bit I guess more of an overview, but again, if you want more specifics, if you want examples, if you want feedback, please email me and let me know, and I would be more than happy to support and assist in any way that I can. So again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next month.